Hello everyone, my name is Momoko Hayamizu. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, I'll explain some of my research results in the field of combinatorial phylogenetics. The goal of today's lecture is to introduce you to the area of discrete mathematical biology. So I start by providing some basics of phylogenetics and discrete mathematics, and then describe some combinatorial problems on phylogenetic trees and networks, which will be solved in the next lecture. So, what is phylogenetics? Phylogenetics is the study of relationships among different groups of organisms and their evolutionary development. It's concerned with tracing the evolutionary histories of organisms, typically by analyzing their genetic or morphological similarities. The term phylogenetics may not be quite familiar to you, but I think most of you have probably seen a tree depicting the evolutionary processes of different species, such as humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and so on. As you see, evolutionary relationships between organisms are commonly represented by a tree called phylogenetic tree. Trees are a fundamental model for describing the evolution of organisms and have various applications, including the study of viral evolution. Interestingly, phylogenetic trees are also widely used in non-biological disciplines to perform hierarchical clustering. For example, by constructing a phylogenetic tree from time series data of stock prices, we can find clusters of similar companies. Indeed, trees are very useful because they are easy to compute, easy to draw, and easy to interpret. This is why trees have so many applications. However, trees have critical drawbacks. Obviously, they are too simple or too restrictive to accurately represent complicated information. This is problematic because real-world data are almost never precisely represented by a tree. And when we analyze real-world data, we must deal with noise and uncertainty in them. To see this, let's look at two simple examples illustrated here. Suppose we wish to estimate the evolution of three species: fish, dolphins, and cats. The first example illustrates the situation where the graph reconstructed from the data are not very tree-like, possibly due to noise or errors in the data, but the correct evolutionary history should be represented by a tree, as indicated by the solid line. As in this example, even if a tree is an appropriate model, we always need to handle such noise or errors in the data. The next picture illustrates a similar but different situation. Imagine that we have two different sources of information on the similarities between the species, and that one source is more reliable than the other. Just for illustrative purposes, suppose we have constructed two evolutionary trees from morphological data and from genetic data, respectively. And the tree reconstructed from the genetic information is thought to be more reliable. We assume so. According to the genetic data, the evolutionary scenario shown by the blue line is correct with probability 0.9. As we know, dolphins are mammals and are genetically closer to cats than to fish. So by focusing on the genetic data, we obtain this evolutionary tree with likelihood 0.9, as indicated by the blue solid line. By contrast, morphologically, dolphins are obviously closer to fish in appearance. So, as indicated by the red solid line, the morphological data suggests that the other possibility whose likelihood is 0.1. Less likely than the first one, but it's not negligible. this is a case of uncertainty about the true evolutionary history. As the second example shows, a single phylogenetic tree is often not sufficient to fully describe the given information, so we need to use two or more incompatible trees, possibly with different weights, in order to accurately represent such complex information. This is not the focus of this lecture, but let me just mention there are other situations where phylogenetic trees do not work very well. For example, as you see on the left, it's common for new species to arise from hybridization of different species, especially in the case of plants. Hybridization is an event that requires merging as well as branching, so we can't describe that event by a phylogenetic tree. Apart from that, it's also well known that in the case of bacteria and viruses, a special event called horizontal gene transfer can occur, as you see on the right. In the case of most animals, including human, genes are only transmitted vertically from parents to offspring. As all of us know, we can't get a good gene from a friend or someone nearby. But surprisingly to us, some bacteria and viruses have a way to do so. This is called horizontal gene transfer, which is another example of non-tree-like evolution. In this lecture, I will not discuss these topics further, but the important thing is there are many situations in biology that require graph structures more complex than trees. This is why we consider phylogenetic networks. They are generalization of phylogenetic trees. Phylogenetic networks provide a more flexible model of evolution because they allow not only branching but also merging of evolutionary lineages. But this doesn't mean that network models are always more useful than trees. It's true that extending the concept of phylogenetic trees, phylogenetic networks are able to represent complex data and phenomena, but many problems related to phylogenetic networks have been shown to be NP-hard, and also there are still many computational problems whose complexity is not well understood. The focus of this lecture is, as we have seen earlier, the situation where we wish to identify the true tree inside a complex phylogenetic network. It's similar to the idea of removing noise from measured raw data to extract meaningful signals. Likewise, we use a phylogenetic network to accurately represent real-world data and then estimate the true evolutionary tree to explain the data by removing unnecessary arcs. There are many different computational problems relevant to this setting. For example, the most basic is the decision and search problems. Informally speaking, given the phylogenetic network, the decision problem asks whether the underlying tree of the network exists, and the search problem asks to find the underlying tree if it exists. As you see, it's possible that there are two or more underlying trees in the same network. So the counting problem asks how many there are, and the listing problem asks to generate all or a designated number of underlying trees. And the optimization problem asks to find the best one. Because so far I have only shown small examples, these computational problems may seem too easy. But look at this picture. If the size of the network increases just a little bit, it's not quite obvious how many solutions there are and which one is optimal. I will state these problems more formally later today, but important thing is the focus of my study is not placed on creating algorithms for each problem or analyzing the complexity of each problem. Rather, the key point of my study is the development of a more general framework for solving different problems in a unified manner. So just like the structure theorem for finitely generated abelian groups, which I think learned in algebra class, I proved a structure theorem for phylogenetic networks, which reveals the uniquely decomposable structure of phylogenetic networks and the set of underlying trees. As I'll show you in the next lecture, the structure theorem for phylogenetic networks immediately derives a series of fast algorithms for various computational problems. Okay, so before formally stating those problems, I'll explain necessary mathematical terms and notation. A graph is defined to be a pair of sets of vertices and edges, and two graphs are called isomorphic if there exists a bijection that preserves adjacency. So informally, as illustrated here, two graphs can be considered to be the same graph even if they look very different. In this lecture, I'll use the terms graph and network interchangeably. All graphs considered here are finite, which means that both the number of vertices and the number of arcs are finite, and simple, which means no multiple arcs and no loops. And directed, which means every edge is oriented, and acyclic, which means no directed cycles. The two figures at the bottom are examples of such a graph. As I said, a graph is defined to be a pair of sets of vertices and arcs. So a graph having a set of vertices V and a set of arcs A is denoted by an ordered pair of V and A. Also, given a graph G, V of G represents the set of vertices of G, and A of G represents the set of arcs of G. This is also a standard graph theoretical notation. An arc oriented from a vertex U to a vertex V is denoted by parenthesis U, V, close parenthesis. For any arc A, the head of arc A means the vertex which A arrives at, and the tail of A refers to the vertex which A starts from. Given a vertex V of a graph G, the number of arcs incoming to V is called in degree of V. Similarly, the number of arcs outgoing from V is called out degree of V. For example, the vertex V in this figure has in degree 1 and out degree 2. Given a graph, the operation of subdividing its arc consists of inserting a new vertex and replacing the arc in question with the directed path from path of length 2. The resulting graph is called a subdivision of original graph. For example, so a graph H is a subdivision of a graph G. The reverse operation of arc subdivision is called vertex smoothing, and two graphs are said to be homeomorphic if they are isomorphic after smoothing all vertices of in degree 1 and out degree 1. For example, graph G and graph H are not isomorphic, but they are homeomorphic. Decomposition of a graph is one of the key words in this lecture. Suppose G is a graph and A prime is a subset of its arc set. For example, for a graph G depicted in the bottom, A1 is a subset of its arc set, right? So if we choose A1, then the two arcs in A1 specify the graph in red, G parenthesis A1 close parenthesis, which is the subgraph of G induced by A1. Next, we consider partitioning the arc set A of G into non-empty subsets. Here we have partitioned A of G into 3 subsets, A1, A2, and A3. Then each subset induces a subgraph of graph G as indicated of different colors. The collection of these three are called the composition of a graph G. In this lecture, X, the symbol X, always denotes a non-empty finite set, which can be interpreted as a set of present-day species. The set X is sometimes called label set or leaf set. So we now state the definitions of phylogenetic trees and networks. Here I define phylogenetic networks first because phylogenetic trees are just a special case of them. So a phylogenetic network, more formally, a rooted binary phylogenetic X network, or a phylogenetic network on X, is defined to be any directed acyclic graph N that has the following three properties. First, there exists a 1-to-1 correspondence between the label set X and the set of leaves of N. Second, N has a unique root whose in degree is 0. Third, any other vertex has in degree 1, out degree 2, or in degree 2 and out degree 1. A vertex of in degree 2 and out degree 1 is called a reticulation vertex of N. In the case when N has no reticulation vertex, N is particularly called a rooted binary phylogenetic X tree, or tree on X. In this lecture, we often omit rooted binary and stuff because we only consider such networks. For notational simplicity, we use the notation Tx and Nx to represent collections of all rooted binary phylogenetic X trees and networks. Okay, so we have defined phylogenetic trees and its generalization, phylogenetic networks. There are many subclasses of phylogenetic networks, but in this lecture we discuss problems regarding tree-based networks, as shown here. So what are tree-based networks? As the name indicates, tree-based networks are phylogenetic networks that can be obtained from a phylogenetic tree. Well, they are very easy to construct. We first pick any rooted binary phylogenetic X tree as a base initial tree. Then if we subdivide arcs of the base tree, then new vertices appear. Like this. They are new vertices. Then we place extra arcs between them and perform the vertex smoothing operation where possible. The resulting phylogenetic network is called tree-based network. So they can be intuitively understood as a phylogenetic tree plus additional noises. This definition is fine, but in this lecture I use the following equivalent definition. Suppose N is a rooted binary phylogenetic X network and T prime is a rooted binary phylogenetic X network, the same X. Then if it has a spanning tree, T, that is a subdivision of T prime, then N is called a tree-based network and T is called subdivision tree of N. Remembering the previous example about the evolution of fish, dolphins, and cats, we can see that a subdivision tree of N is nothing but a tree underlying the non-tree-like data. Here are some important remarks on tree-based networks and subdivision trees. First, tree-based networks form a proper subclass of phylogenetic networks. In other words, there exists a phylogenetic network that has no subdivision tree. The network on the right is an example of such a network. From this observation, it's natural to ask, given a phylogenetic network N, how to determine whether N is tree-based or not, and how to find subdivision tree of N if N is tree-based. This is what the decision and search problems are asking for. The second remark is that any phylogenetic network can be converted into tree-based network by attaching extra leaves. This observation leads to the following variant of the decision problem, which I call the deviation quantification problem. The question here is how to measure deviation from being tree-based, where the deviation measure delta is defined to be the minimum number of extra leaves required to make N tree-based. This problem is a variant of the previous decision problem. In the decision problem, the only question is whether the network is tree-based or not, so the answer is always yes or no. But in this problem, if the network is not tree-based, we want to evaluate, we want to quantify how much the network deviates from being tree-based. The final remark is that, as I said, tree-based network can have many subdivision trees. This example network has only 2, but in general, the number of subdivision trees can be exponentially many. So it's natural to ask how to compute the number alpha. This is what the counting problem is asking for. Likewise, a listing problem requires computing the list of all subdivision trees of N. So far, we have only considered problems where the input network is unweighted. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it's also interesting to consider optimization problems where each arc has a weight, positive weight, such as a probability, and we want to maximize some objective functions such as the likelihood or log likelihood. There was no previous work on this optimization problem, but recalling alpha can be exponential. We can immediately see that a naive approach would take exponential time. The last problem is a combination of the optimization problem and the enumeration problem, listing problem. In many practical situations, the value of the objective function can be almost the same in the first, second, third, and case places. In such situations, it's not a good idea to compute only one optimal tree, ignoring all the nearly optimal solutions. That might be very meaningful or insightful biologically. So it's meaningful to consider how to compute the ranking of top K trees in a tree-based networks. To recap today's lecture, we have learned the definitions of phylogenetic trees and networks, and the concepts of tree-based networks and subdivision trees. Then we have seen various computational problems associated with finding the true evolutionary tree within complicated phylogenetic network. Okay, this is the end of today's lecture. In the next video, I'll show you a structure theorem for phylogenetic networks that solves all the problems we discussed today.